One of the many surprises that the US Navy had as Japan rolled across the Pacific in 1942 was the effectiveness of their seaplane fighters. Being able to set up a base and operate reconnaissance, strike, and even interceptors with minimal support seemed like a game changer. Before the Coral Sea and Midway gave the US Navy more confidence in the ability of their carrier forces, the service had become interested in acquiring their own seaplane fighter. Their interest was piqued when they captured a largely intact Nakajima A6M2N roof. The roof was a conversion of the Zero and, despite its float, exhibited excellent performance. Other than in top speed, it was the match for its carrier base cousin. Small detachments occasionally engaged US aircraft, but they mainly duelled with PT boats and would actually sink a submarine later in the war. So, as part of its wide front of industrial responses, the US Navy commissioned Grumman to develop a floatplane version of the Wildcat. The tactical rationale for the aircraft was to defend Pacific Islands in advance of conventional landing strips being built, and on the assumption that insufficient carriers would be available to provide a defensive umbrella. The Edo Corporation of Long Island, New York developed two large aluminium floats to be fitted beneath an F4 F3 Wildcat. This rather rugged installation is in stark contrast to the sleek and well thought out single float on the roof. The Edo floats were intended for lower performance aircraft and they lacked any meaningful attempt at streamlining. They were, however, available and needs must. Wheeled beach landing gear was fitted to the floats so that the aircraft could easily be dragged up the beach without specialized equipment. The wheel wells for the main landing gear were fared over. Because of the float's large surface area, two small auxiliary rudders were attached to the horizontal tail planes to provide additional yaw control. These proved insufficient to make the aircraft stable in practice, so a large fixed ventral fin was also added beneath the vertical tail. For the purposes of initial testing, the Wildcat's 450 caliber Browning machine guns were removed, but as you can see in the picture, bomb racks were retained. Guns were reinstalled later. This aircraft was slightly whimsically referred to as the Wildcatfish. It retained the Wildcat's 38-foot span and 39-foot fuselage length. Height was obviously much greater, being 18 feet and 9 inches versus 11 feet and 10 inches on the wheeled version. Weight was apparently only marginally up, 7,500 pounds versus 7,400. Although this seems odd because of the size of the floats, the Wildcat's landing gear and associated hydraulics were likely to have been quite weighty next to the hollow floats. Drag was another matter. When the Wildcatfish took to the sky on February 28, 1943, it immediately demonstrated why the roof only had one float. The 1,200 horsepower double Wasp could only drag the portly seaplane to 240 miles an hour, 80 down on the conventional F4 F3. This was not good news as the Wildcat was itself considered to be too slow against the Zero. The Wildcatfish also lost some of the Wildcat's aerobatic abilities in the process. While the disappointing initial testing was progressing, the shape of the Pacific War was changing. The Seabees were proving themselves remarkably adept at building landing strips on small islands in frankly unbelievable time, and US shipyards had begun the process of churning out aircraft carriers at a rate that most countries make canned food. The need for a good seaplane fighter was thus reduced to near zero, and the Wildcatfish was evidently not a good seaplane fighter, so the lone example was converted back into a conventional aircraft. Although a floatplane version of the much more powerful Hellcat was mooted, it was never built. In the US, the idea was quietly abandoned until the nuclear threat to carriers revived the idea in the Convair Sea Dart. The Royal Navy also considered deploying floatplane fighters in the Second World War. In 1942, Blackburn were commissioned to develop such an aircraft. Their first attempt, the B-43, was their new Firebrand carrier fighter fitted with two floats. This was short-lived and they moved on to the B-44. B-44 also started life as a Firebrand, but moved away from that core design over time. It was rather more sophisticated than the Wildcatfish, most notably because it was fitted with retractable floats. These suck up to the underside of the fuselage to create a rather deep, but clearly more aerodynamic profile. The Firebrand's clipped wings were exchanged for elliptical types. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Napier Sabre driving counter-rotating propellers, it was armed with four 20mm cannons and it was intended to hit 355 miles an hour. Extensive tests of models were done in water tanks to ensure that spray would not swamp the engine on takeoff and landing, but this was as far as the project got. Issues with the basic Firebrand and the reality that its performance was now inadequate against the latest Axis bombers led to B-44 being cancelled. The closest the Allies got to a float-plane fighter was actually their first attempt, although curiously its deployment would be attempted after all the other projects had been cancelled. After the invasion of Norway in April 1940, the RAF had a Spitfire Mark I converted with floats that they'd borrowed from an experimental seaplane version of the Blackburn Rock. This was deemed necessary because the fleet air-arm fighter of the day was the Gloucester Sea Gladiator, and thus it was no match for the Bf-109. Nicknamed, perhaps ironically, the Narvik Nightmare, like the later Wildcatfish, a central fin was needed for the Spitfire to have adequate stability. While a Mark I was taken off the line and modified at Woolston, tank tests on a 1:7 scale model suggested the concept should work well enough. The aircraft itself had actually already arrived at RAF Kirkbride in Cumbria a week earlier for flotation and taxiing trials, but it was quickly discovered that the Spitfire and Rock float combination was a very unstable aircraft on the water, and therefore totally unsuitable. The loss of Norway led to the project and the 16 floatplane Hurricanes that had also been ordered being shelved. Converted back to a land plane, the Spitfire was shot down during the Battle of Britain on September 18, 1940. Later experimentation suggested that the Spitfire was fundamentally more suitable than the Hurricane for floatplane use because the Hawker fighter's radiator and flaps were more vulnerable to damage from spray on takeoff. Declaration of war against Japan led to the idea of a Spitfire floatplane being revived in early 1942. In a way, this represented a kind of full circle given the Spit's origins in the Schneider Trophy monoplanes. The job was assigned to Foland Aircraft and the conversion was on a Mark V-B. It was fitted with an 1100 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin 45. It had a 4-bladed propeller though instead of the landplane version's 3-bladed unit. In this configuration, the aircraft had a top speed of 324 miles an hour, a range of 326 miles, and a service ceiling of 33,400 feet. A Vokes filter was fitted to the carburetor air intake, the same as that found on the tropical 5C Spitfire, and presumably needed to resist spray. The ventral fin extension was added beneath the tail again. Other changes included external lifting points forward of and behind the cockpit to allow movement off a seaplane tender by crane, a strengthened wing spar, and a spin recovery parachute. Armament was the same as the landplane Spitfire 5B, two 20mm cannons and four 303 machine guns. Arthur Shervill, who had designed the Schneider Trophy aircraft's floats, was brought in to do the same for the Spitfire. They were 25.5 feet long, streamlined and graceful. They did, however, leak quite badly, which caused delays throughout the program. The prototype made its first flight on the 12th of October 1942. It was capable of 313 miles an hour in reality, which was reasonably impressive. Otherwise, its performance was comparable to a landplane Spitfire. After further trials, the decision was taken to convert a further 2 Spitfire Mark V-Bs. The initial intention was for these aircraft to be based around the Dodecanese Islands in the southwest Aegean Sea and intercept German transports flying over the eastern Mediterranean. The aircraft were shipped to Egypt during October 1943. Unfortunately, in early October, the Germans captured the British-held Kos and Leros Islands. Even so, the deployment continued. The operating concept was that the Spitfires would operate remotely in a cluster of islands and be supplied from a Royal Navy submarine. The flight comprised 5 pilots, 15 ground crew, 2 high-speed launches, and a Supermarine Walrus amphibian. Training started on the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt, and problems immediately occurred. The engine torque on takeoff caused one float to dip under the water, allowing salt water to run over the rear fuselage and rendering the water rudders virtually useless. After a very short period of time, this increased saltwater corrosion had a dramatic effect on all three airframes, to the extent that one of them had to have a new rear fuselage transplanted. It was struck off charge on the 28th of January 1944 and then somewhat disappeared into the ether. In addition to the practical problems, on the logistical side, the Navy's submarine service was already stretched in their normal role in the Mediterranean area and couldn't realistically be spared as cargo ships. The three aircraft therefore stayed in Egypt. Lacking obvious employment in the Mediterranean, the ministry considered moving them and the 12 spare sets of floats to the Far East. Their plan was to convert a dozen additional aircraft in theatre, but after some thought they decided not to. The aircraft were returned to the UK and scrapped in December 1944. The final conversion made by Folan was a Mark 9B, powered by the 1720 horsepower Merlin. It could hit 377 miles an hour and it had a range of over 400 miles. This aircraft flew on the 6th of July 1944, but it was never deployed operationally. The principal reason for this was that it was rubbish. The test pilot found that not only was this variant reluctant to become airborne at all, but on takeoff the fitted tropical filter ingressed water, causing engine cutouts at critical times. The aircraft also waddled from side to side on the floats when taxiing, which could be dangerous in an operational situation. It therefore languished for a time before being returned to Folan in August and then scrapped on November the 22nd, 1945. I should mention that most accounts have this aircraft as a Mark 10, but I don't believe that's correct. Supermarine were actually persuaded by the Air Ministry to submit a proposal for a Griffin-engined Spitfire floatplane in 1945, but the war ended before it could be realised. Despite all of these false starts and disappointments, seaplane fighters didn't die their death in the UK at this stage either. Sanders Row were already working on their own entry into the canon of boat fighter might have beens.